It's a work of mercy. All of them are. That means they're hard. If they were a walk in the park, we wouldn't call them works of mercy. It's an effort. They're in our sinful, fallen world, given my sinful condition, they're always an effort.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the senior publishing director at Word on Fire. We all strive to be spiritually great. We want to be magnanimous men and women, great-souled people. But how do we get there? Well, the church offers a concrete sevenfold path, and that's what we'll discuss today with Bishop Robert Barron, joining us from Rochester, Minnesota. Bishop, good to see you as always.
Hey, Brandon. Good morning to you.
You just got back from your old stomping grounds in California. Yeah. You went over there for a few days. Tell us about that trip. What'd you do and how did it go?
Yeah, I went really for two official reasons. One was to preside at the wedding of Madeline Lear and her husband. Madeline's the youngest daughter of the legendary TV producer Norman Lear, whom I came to know a little bit when I was out in California. And as a touch of sadness, Madeline got married just a few days ago, and just a few weeks before the wedding, her dad died. So Norman was at the age of 101. So it was kind of a poignancy to it, but it was a lovely wedding at St. Monica's Church in Santa Monica. So I saw a lot of my old friends back there and presided at that wedding. Then a few days later, I confirmed Shia LaBeouf. So Shia, as many of our listeners know, I met when I was in California. We did that interview that was viewed by a lot of people. Well, he's hung in there with his formation as a Catholic, and so he petitioned for confirmation and asked if I would do it. So I went out there to the lovely mission of Santa Ynez, which I knew very well from my pastoral region. That's where I first met Shia, and presided at his confirmation, which is very moving and a lovely event. So those were the two official reasons I went back, and then I saw a lot of my old buddies and friends back there too.
Well, God bless Madeline and her husband and Shia and all of our friends back in California there. Well, a couple weeks ago, we discussed the 7 corporal works of mercy. And today, we're going to discuss the 7 spiritual works of mercy, the sort of parallel grouping. First of all, what's the connection between these two sets? Is one more important than the other? Does one have a higher priority in the eyes of the church? Talk about the connection between the corporal works and the spiritual works.
Isn't that interesting, Brandon? I think that's a very important point. They asked Aquinas, why do we have sacraments? Why don't we just, receive the grace of God and we understand that God's a spirit and we've received it? And his answer was, well, because we're not angels. If we were angels, maybe that would be true, but we're not. We're embodied spirits. And so there needs to be both matter and form, he said, in the sacraments, right? The form appealing to the mind, the matter to the body. Well, something similar here, I think. We're both body and soul. We're embodied spirits. And so God's mercy comes to us both in soul and in body. And you might read that as a way of understanding two types of reductionism. One is you hyper-spiritualize the faith. It's all just about the spiritual order. You forget about the body. Well, there are forms of Gnosticism that do that. Or go the other extreme. And I think you find it in a lot of forms of liberal Christianity today, which is reducing, if you want, to the material. It's all about, economic well-being and material well-being and taking care of the material needs of the poor, et cetera. And the church has said both and, as it typically does. It says, no, there are enormous spiritual needs we have, and they have got to be met with the spiritual works of mercy, and enormous physical needs. They're met by the corporal works of mercy. So I like that instinct. And I've used it actually in conversation with people who want to reduce sometimes, I think, the Christian life to taking care of the economic or bodily needs of the poor. And I'll say, look, there are a lot of forms of poverty, not just economic and bodily poverty. Someone who's ignorant, someone who is spiritually bereft, someone who's sad, someone who's unforgiven. Well, those are all people who have great needs, but not at the material level, but the spiritual level. And the church wants to address all those forms of poverty.
Let me just briefly list out these 7 spiritual works of mercy. We'll go through each one of them in more length, but here they are briefly. Admonish the sinner, instruct the ignorant, counsel the doubtful, comfort the sorrowful, bear wrongs patiently, forgive all injuries, and pray for the living and the dead. Why is it, you kind of hinted at this already, but say more about why it is that the church says it's not enough for us to love others only with our body? Why is it important that we meet the spiritual needs of their minds and their souls as well?
Right. Well, to love is to will the good of the other. And so there are goods in the spiritual order, and we just implicitly named all of them. Intellectual goods and goods of the soul and moral goods and so on. And so that's an expression of love and mercy, is to will the good of the other at that level and not just at the material level.
Well, again, let's walk through each of these 7 spiritual works of mercy.
Good.
As I said earlier, you might consider these the pathway to spiritual greatness. If you want to be a spiritually magnanimous person, do these 7 things. And so let's maybe use these, as we did for the corporal works of mercy, as an examination of our own consciences to discern how we're doing in each of these areas. So let's start with the first one, admonish the sinner. This isn't one that gets a lot of attention usually in most parishes or places, but why is this one important?
Boy, it's so important, isn't it? Monio in Latin, to warn, right? To admonish a sinner is to warn a sinner that he or she is on a bad spiritual path. Now, I know in our Western culture, the etiquette is very much hands off. Don't talk about someone's religion. It's none of your business. That's your private concern. Don't tell me what to do. But see, that's repugnant, Brandon, to a healthy Christianity, because we are our brother's keepers. We are our sister's keepers. We're on for each other. And part of that, go back to the book of the prophet Ezekiel, when he's given that charge to warn the people of Israel. You're a father. I mean, you know that. If your kids are doing something that's really destructive, either to others or to themselves, and you don't do anything about it, you never warn them about it, or even if they're not even on that bad path, but they might be tempted by it, and you'd be a pretty bad father if you never warned them, don't go down this path. So that's the model, I think, with our brothers and sisters. We don't do it obnoxiously. We don't do it in a Pharisaical way and all those bad things. But look, what you're doing right now is dangerous to yourself and to others. And it's an act of love. It's an act of mercy to point that out. I'll say one last thing about it. I think one of the dimensions of the clergy sex abuse scandal was that we priests and religious didn't do nearly enough of this, admonishing sinners. Priests who saw someone who was engaged in some questionable behavior and never warned the sinner, never challenged the sinner. That at least contributed to that problem. So, fraternal correction, it's an old phrase we use. It's a good phrase. Do it in the gospel manner. You don't run to the internet and complain about someone. Go to that person one-on-one. And if that doesn't work, bring in one more witness. That doesn't work, bring in a few more. If that doesn't work, bring it to the church. Remember from the Gospel of Matthew. But that's all under the rubric of admonishing the sinner.
All right, let's turn to the second spiritual work of mercy, which is instruct the ignorant. I think that word is usually used pejoratively. Nobody likes to be considered ignorant, but how do we practice this spiritual work?
Yeah, and good. That distinction, ignorant doesn't mean stupid. I mean, so if someone's stupid, they're lacking in some basic intellectual capacity. Ignorant just means I don't know. I don't know. And so filling up the mind of someone who doesn't know some important things, that's a work of mercy. Every teacher knows that. I was a teacher for a long time. But in any field of endeavor, you're teaching a kid mathematics, you're teaching history, you're teaching science. Beautiful. That's a merciful act to fill up their eager mind with truth, because that's one of the basic spiritual hungers we have. I used to tease my students at Mundelein over the years. I would say, that's the work of mercy that I practice on a regular basis. I instruct the ignorant. I would gesture to them. They never seem to like that. But it hinges on that distinction between, I wasn't saying I instruct stupid people. I'm saying I'm offering, I hope, spiritual wisdom, intellectual wisdom, to those who are hungry for it. That's a merciful act. And I'd say to every teacher, you're a teacher, Brandon, as a parent. I mean, every parent is. That's an act of mercy. So don't see that as somehow divorced from the spiritual or moral order. It's not. Again, I resisted those over the years who would say, well, you're out there at the seminary, in your ivory tower, and I'm here working on the streets with the poor. I said, well, I'm working with the poor as well. I'm working with those who are intellectually poor. And I'm feeding their minds as you're perhaps feeding their bodies. So they're both works of mercy. Don't set them, against each other.
The third spiritual work of mercy is counsel the doubtful. Talk to us about that one.
Boy, how relevant today, isn't it, Brandon, when so many, especially young people, doubt religion. All the avatars and evangelists of atheism and materialism and determinism, they're thick on the ground. They're out there. They're in the internet space. And they've produced in the minds of a lot of people doubts about God, about eternal life, about the soul, about all these spiritual truths. We were pretty bad at it, in my judgment. When the new atheist evangelists were doing their work, we were pretty bad at counseling the doubtful. It's related in a way to instructing the ignorant, I suppose, but if someone's got a doubt about the religious side of life, help them. Help them with it. Don't withdraw into your privacy. Don't say, well, that's your problem. No, that's a form of poverty. That's a real spiritual poverty. Well, get educated. Get apologetic material. Consult, whether it's online or through books, some of the best minds on these things, so that you can counsel those who are doubting spiritual truth. And don't play the American game of just, this is all private. That's a private concern of yours. Who am I to tell you what to do? No, I know this, Brandon, from my own life, that when you become doubtful about high spiritual things, that's a form of suffering. That's a form of pain. It's spiritual suffering. Well, it's a merciful person that wants to address that situation. So who are people around you right now? Again, you as a father, maybe your kid's going through difficult times. I think of the famous case, you'll like this, of William F. Buckley, when his son, Christopher Buckley, who's become a famous writer himself, but he started losing his faith, when he was a teenager. And his dad they went on vacation, and his dad read to him Chesterton's Orthodoxy. He just read it aloud to him, Well, that was a work of mercy. He was counseling the doubtful at that point. Now, maybe that's not your thing to read Chesterton aloud, but find some way to do it, because doubt is a form of suffering and poverty.
You and I, over the years, have both read lots of books and studies regarding people who have left the church. And one of the most alarming and clear findings from these studies is how many young people would say, I drifted away in middle school, high school, or college because no one answered my questions.
Right.
And one thing that sticks out to me in a lot of those responses, though, is that oftentimes the young people didn't volunteer that they had doubts. It requires a little probing to figure out, okay, you are struggling with this or that belief or concept or practice in the church.
Yeah.
So I think those of us here who are wanting to practice this spiritual work need to do a little active work to find those who are doubting in order to help them.
Yeah, good. Just as we seek out the materially poor sometimes, we have to go find where they are. We have to seek out the spiritually suffering too.
Okay, so we're running through the 7 spiritual works of mercy. First was admonish the sinner. Second was instruct the ignorant. Third was counsel the doubtful. Let's turn now to the fourth one, which is comfort the sorrowful. Talk to us about this one.
It's so fundamental, isn't it? Everyone is sorrowful in some way. I don't know a human being on planet Earth right now who isn't suffering in some way or mourning something. But think of more extreme cases. Someone who's just lost a loved one, someone who is lonely. They've just moved to a new city. They have no friends or connections. Someone who's failed. They wanted something and it didn't happen. Someone's just been fired from her job. There are a lot of people around us all the time who are sorrowing. Well, address them, find them, seek them out, help them, counsel them, spend time with them. Think of in the book of Job, before they start speaking and making a mess of things, the friends of Job sit with him silently for 7 days. Good. That's called comforting the sorrowful. Find someone, and it's not that hard. We all know someone right now who's sorrowing over something. Seek them out. Don't wait for them to come to you, but you find a way to come to them and offer them comfort. It's like someone who's hungry or thirsty. You know, it's a real elemental need, isn't it? Someone who's sorrowing, that's a suffering. It's a pain and emptiness at a very deep level. I think of, when I was doing parish work many years ago, it's like visiting lonely people was a big part of the job. I used to go most Fridays, and I bring communion to elderly folks who couldn't, get out of the house. And I brought the Lord to them sacramentally. But a lot of the visit was spending time with lonely people who were sorrowing. And I remember, I'd have to make the rounds of like several people within a few hours. So the moment would always come when I'd say, well, I have to leave now. And just the look of pain on their face because they look forward to that moment of that visit. Well, good. That's a spiritual work of mercy to do that.
The fifth spiritual work of mercy is bear wrongs patiently.
Yeah.
It strikes me that among all 14 works, the 7 corporal and the 7 spiritual, this one among all of them, you might say is the only one that is passively done. You're not doing anything. You're not responding to people who have wronged you with harsh criticism or reaction. Talk to us about this one. Bear wrongs patiently.
Yeah, one of the verses that I've always loved is bear patiently the troublesome. So we all know what that's about. There are people in our lives, and we come across them practically every day, who for whatever reason are just difficult to be with. They're troublesome. They are annoying. They're boring. They're tedious and tiresome. They're intrusive. They're impolite. Just go through your day. And maybe when you examine your conscience at the end of the day, call them to mind. Who were some troublesome people that I had to deal with today? Well, there's a classic reaction to troublesome people, which is to walk away from them, to bark at them, to criticize them in turn, to bore them as much as they're boring you. There's all ways that we can deal with the troublesome, or we could bear it patiently. We could respond in love, willing the good of the other to someone who's troubling us. One thing I think of, because I'm not a big talker on airplanes. I'm on airplanes a lot, but I kind of put the headphones in and I watch a movie or something, or read a book, because you never really know. Here's this person next to you. You have no idea who this person is. And sometimes it doesn't work and the person starts talking, and it might be in a very troublesome way. It might be annoying or tedious. But I think of this work of mercy in those situations where, okay, why was this person sent to me right now? If you believe in divine providence, and as Aquinas says, God's providence extends to particulars, you and I right now having this conversation is part of God's providence. All right, why was this troublesome person put in my path today? I always like Jose Maria Escrivá on this one, where he said, don't say, gosh, this person is really bugging me. Say, Lord, thank you because this person is sanctifying me. Was this troublesome person sent to sanctify me, to draw forth from me my patience, my forbearance, my love, my generosity, So it's such a practical one. I like that about it. And we all face it almost every day. Not everyone you meet is a great friend and is full of fun and delightful to be with. In fact, most people aren't. And then some are the opposite. They're annoying, they're boring, they're troublesome. Okay. Use that as an opportunity to love. That's this work of mercy.
Obviously, all 14 of these works are embodied in the person of Jesus Christ. Yeah. Jesus demonstrated how perfectly to do all of these things. But for this one especially, I think of Christ bearing wrongs patiently in the last hours of his life. He's insulted, he's beaten, he's mocked, and he just takes it. He absorbs all of it into himself and thereby diffuses it. But I think he's the great exemplar, especially of this one.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, number 6, the 6th spiritual work of mercy is to forgive all injuries. Talk about that one.
Yeah, boy, how central to the teaching and practice of Jesus was forgiveness. And we every day in the Lord's Prayer, as often as you pray it, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. To forgive, it's it's a work of justice, and beyond justice, a work of love. When you forgive someone, if you're separated like this, and you've done your part, that's an act of justice. But then they haven't moved. To forgive is to kind of bear their burden, to go the extra step to be reconciled. Well, that's asking too much. Yeah, I know it is. That's the whole point. It is asking too much. It's not fair. He should have moved too, and you would have met in the middle. But he didn't move. So you've got to bear his burden. You have to actively forgive. And it's exceptionally difficult. But, Brandon, look at every troubled place in the world, and you'll find near the heart of it an incapacity to forgive. Justice, that's why after years and years and years of hearing justice, 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 I'm always a little bit wary of so much justice language, because justice is always shouted by everybody on all sides of conflicts. But what resolves the conflict goes beyond justice. It has to. It's not less than justice. So I'm not bad-mouthing justice, but you've got to go beyond justice, I think, if you want to resolve a conflict. And I think that's why it's so central to Jesus' preaching and praxis. Again, go back to your example of the Lord on the cross, right? Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. As he bears the sins of the world, his answer is not vengeance or violence. It's forgiving, love. Yeesh, boy, it's hard. Mind you, it's a work of mercy. All of them are. That means they're hard. Right? If they were walking the park, we wouldn't call them works of mercy. It's an effort. They're in our sinful, fallen world, given my sinful condition, they're always an effort. This one especially, it's a work of mercy to forgive. The end of the day, can you look back and say, okay, did I forgive someone today? And that has to do with your heart, but also with external action. Did I write a note? Did I make a phone call? Did I reach out in conversation? Did I say a forgiving word to someone? That's a tough one. But it's a work of mercy.
Well, the seventh and final spiritual work of mercy, the way to be spiritually great, is to pray for the living and the dead. Why is this one critical?
Yeah, we pray. Is prayer for us? Sure. I spent my holy hour this morning, partly in meditation. I prayed the Jesus prayer this morning. Some of it is just, I have these cards in my prayer book that, of great saints that I spend time just meditating on them. So, prayers for me, sure, in a way, but an aspect of prayer, and I try to bring it to every holy hour, has to be praying for others. Bringing to mind when you pray those who are in need. And, don't press me on it, because I don't know the answer, to lay out the exact metaphysical dynamics of how all this works. But I know it's at the heart of our great tradition that we are connected to each other spiritually, and that somehow in asking God to help someone, I channel something. I become a vehicle in God's providence of his mercy toward another. We experience co-inherence, right, as Charles Williams called it. We inhere in each other. And so as Christ bore the sins of the world and offered forgiveness to us, so we can bear each other's burdens, physically, yes, but more importantly, spiritually. I can through my prayer help to bear the burden of somebody. And so that's a huge part of prayer. When you say to someone, how's your prayer life? Oh, I really haven't prayed in years. Well, that's bad for that person, yeah, but it's also bad for all the people that he should have been praying for. I would say that a lot when I was teaching at Mundelein, and the young guys were learning the Liturgy of the Hours, and they'd say, Father, sometimes I just don't feel like it. It's such a burden. And I say, well, I don't care. I don't care what you feel like it. You're not praying just for you to get your spiritual, elevation. You're praying for, and that's the training, for a priest. When you pray the Liturgy of the Hours, you're especially praying for the people that you serve. All my priesthood, and now as a bishop, I'm very aware of it. When I pray now, it's this diocese. It's Winona, Rochester that I'm praying for above all. And it's the priests, it's the people I met here, Those I know who are suffering, I'll bring them to mind. One thing too, Brandon, people staying away from Mass on Sunday, bad for all kinds of reasons. But I'll tell you, one reason it's really bad is they weren't praying for the living and the dead. That's one thing you do at Mass. Mass is the supreme prayer of the church. All right, good. You're there for your own, edification, sure. But you're also there because you're a member of the mystical body, and you're obligated to pray at that Mass for the living, and for the dead. But one thing, I think you probably heard me do this at Mass at the Prayers of the Faithful. I often say, let's pray for so-and-so who's died. And then I'll say, and let's pray for all the dead who have no one else to pray for them. Someone prayed that many, many years ago, and it stayed in my mind that, okay, I'm saying Mass, the universal prayer of the church, the greatest prayer of the church, offered to the Father in Christ. Well, yeah, I am. I'm going to pray for people I've never met, people I have no idea who they are. They could have lived 1,000 years ago, but I'll pray for them because no one else is praying for them. That's one of the tragedies of absenting ourselves from the Mass, is we don't perform this work of mercy.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. Today we have a question from Matt, who lives in New York. Matt has been away from the church for many years and wonderfully has decided to come back. But he's got a question for you, Bishop, upon his return. Here's his question.
Okay.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Matt from New York. I'm coming back to the church from about a 15-year absence, and all the words changed. What happened? Thanks.
That's a New York question. I like that. That's a direct question. Well, what happened, so you said 15 years ago, it was about, when was it, Brandon? 2011, I think. We made these liturgical changes. So it's been a while now. Gosh, well, it'll be, 13 years now. It's hard to believe it's been that long. But after a long process involving ISIL, which is the International Commission on English and the Liturgy, what was the other? Vox Clara. There were a couple of these great bodies that considered the liturgical text. The sense was that in some ways the translations that followed the council immediately were not adequate to the Latin. And so we went back and provided, and I think in many ways, far more adequate translations. There was a fear, too, that the older translations had certain prejudices in them against the transcendence of God. They were more in the immanent direction. So these two bodies tried to correct those imperfections. And they gave us, beginning in 2011, this new translation. Now, it's really not fair to say that all the words changed. In fact, I'd say most of them remain more or less the same. But we did indeed update and make more faithful to the Latin the renderings of the liturgy. I think most of our people, got used to it pretty fast. There was a great concern. I remember that, like, oh my gosh, what will the people do? And they're going to run away and they won't get it. I think pretty quickly people adapted to them. And I like the prayers much more. They are better crafted. They are more respectful of the beauty of the liturgy, the transcendence of God and all that. But that's what happened about, 13 years ago now.
Well, as we wrap up here, I am delighted to tell you about Word on Fire's newest book. This one is by the inimitable Peter Kreeft. I know many of you who listen to this show are big fans of Peter Kreeft. We published many of his books before. This new one is called Ethics for Beginners, Big Ideas from 32 Great Minds. Socrates once said that a good person does not worry much about the little things, like whether he lives or dies, but only about the one big thing, whether he is a good person or a bad one. In this book, Ethics for Beginners, philosopher Peter Kreeft reclaims the importance of ethical study in answering life's big questions. What is the meaning of life? How should I live? How should I treat other people? Unlike many other modern texts on the subject, this one asserts that ethics is real, that good and evil are knowable, and that we can learn to act well, so become better and happier people. So he looks at the big ideas of 32 of the most important ethical philosophers. If you previously read Socrates' Children, his 4-volume history of philosophy set, this would be a great follow-up book to it. Again, it's called Ethics for Beginners. You can find it at wordonfire.org/ethics. Well, thanks so much for listening and watching. We'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.